Mary saw the portrait and trembled. This boy lived with me at the orphanage, but the worst was yet to come. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. The biting cold of June in Chicago seeped through the cracks of the mansion in the upscale neighborhood, making Mary tighten her worn wool coat over her navy blue uniform. At 52, she carried decades of hard work and disillusionment on her back, leaving deep marks on her brown face, but her brown eyes still sparkled with a determination that life had never managed to completely extinguish. "Mary, could you clean the main room today? We have important guests coming tomorrow," said Helen Montgomery, the mistress, adjusting her pearl necklace over her immaculate beige blazer. Her voice had that polite yet distant tone typical of someone used to giving orders. "Of course, Mrs. Montgomery," Mary replied, grabbing the microfiber cloth and cleaning spray. She had been working in that house for 2 months and still felt like a stranger navigating the marble corridors and Persian rugs. The main room was a spectacle of ostentation. Italian leather armchairs, a glass coffee table worth more than Mary's annual salary, and gold-framed paintings that looked like they had come from a museum. She began to clean methodically, as she always did, when her eyes landed on a photograph hanging on the main wall. It was a formal portrait of a boy about 10 years old, with neatly combed brown hair and piercing green eyes. He wore a small suit, but there was something in his expression that didn't match the elegant pose, a subtle sadness, almost imperceptible, that only someone who had known loneliness would recognize. The cleaning cloth slipped from Mary's hands and fell to the marble floor with a soft thud that echoed through the silent room. Her heart raced, her legs trembled, and a solitary tear rolled down her face as she approached the picture with shaky steps. "Jack," she murmured, bringing her trembling hand to her lips. 40 years dissolved in an instant. Mary was back at St. Vincent's home in Springfield, a suburb of Chicago. She could smell the disinfectant mixed with vegetable soup that always permeated the hallways, hear the sound of rubber slippers on the burnt cement floor, see the peeling walls painted in a faded green that tried, unsuccessfully, to bring some joy. To that place, Jack slept on the top bunk, she on the bottom. He was 9 when he arrived, and she was 12. For 3 years, they were inseparable. He was shy and scared, still waiting for someone to come and take him away. She, older and already knowing that no one would come, became his silent protector. "Mary, when I grow up, I'm going to build a big house and you will live with me," Jack would say on cold winter nights when they shared the thin blanket that barely warmed one body, let alone 2. "Promise," she would ask, knowing that promises in the home were like dry leaves in the wind, beautiful for a moment but destined to fall apart. "I promise," he would reply, holding her hand with the seriousness of someone who didn't yet know the world's cruelties. But one day, when Mary was 15 and Jack was 12, a wealthy family from Chicago came to the home. The boy with the green eyes left one September morning without even a proper goodbye, just waving from the window of the black car that took him far away forever. "Mary, are you okay?" The deep, concerned voice brought her back to the present. She turned quickly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, and found Edward Montgomery standing in the doorway of the room. At 45, the architect was an elegant man, tall with graying temples that gave him a distinguished air. He wore a light blue dress shirt and impeccably pressed khaki pants. But it was his eyes that made Mary's world crumble again, the same piercing green eyes of the boy in the portrait, the same ones she had seen leave 40 years ago. I was just cleaning, Mr. Edward," she stammered, trying to regain her composure. "I dropped the cloth. I'm sorry." Edward stepped closer, and she noticed he was tense as well. His large, well-groomed hands opened and closed nervously, just like Jack used to do when he was worried at the home. The same gesture she would always recognize, even after decades. "That portrait," she began, unable to fully control herself. "The boy in the photo. He reminds me of someone I met a long time ago." Edward's face instantly hardened. He took a step back, and for the first time since she started working there, Mary saw fear in his eyes, the fear of someone with secrets to protect. It's my son, Matthew," Edward lied, his voice slightly trembling. "When he was a child, now he's 16. Mary knew he was lying. She knew Matthew, the couple's teenage son. A boy with curly black hair and brown eyes like his mother, nothing like the boy in the portrait. But she said nothing, just nodded and bent down to pick up the cloth from the floor. "Mary," Edward said, and there was a subtle urgency in his voice. You never lived in homes or orphanages, did you?" The question hit her like a punch to the stomach. She straightened slowly, looking directly into those green eyes she knew so well. "Why do you ask?" "Curiosity," he replied too quickly. "It's just that you seem familiar." The silence that followed was as dense as the fog that covered Chicago on winter mornings. Mary felt her heart beating so loudly that she was sure he could hear it. 40 years of separation, of pain, of longing, seemed to concentrate in that moment. "Mr. Edward," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. What happened to that boy? The one in the photo?" Edward swallowed hard. For a moment it seemed he was going to tell the truth, that the years of lies would finally fall like the yellow leaves of the maples in autumn. But then Helen appeared in the doorway, breaking the moment with her imposing presence. "Edward? Mary? Is something wrong?" "Nothing, dear," Edward quickly replied, regaining his composure with a skill that only comes from years of practice in hiding the truth. "Mary was just admiring Matthew's childhood portrait." Helen looked suspiciously from one to the other, her blue eyes as cold as a Chicago winter. Mary realized that her employer was not just elegant and controlling, she was also perceptive and had noticed the tension in the air. "Mary? When you're done here, could you organize the closet on the second floor? We're having the golf club folks over tomorrow," Helen said, clearly ending any conversation. "Yes, Mrs. Montgomery," Mary murmured, still gazing at the portrait. As the couple walked away, she heard Helen whisper something to Edward, but she couldn't make out the words. What she did see was Edward nervously running his hand through his hair, another gesture that Jack would make. When he was in trouble at the home, alone again in the room, Mary approached the portrait once more. There was no doubt that was Jack, the boy who shared her dreams of being an abandoned child, who promised never to forget her, who disappeared from her life on a cold spring morning. "You've grown and built your big house, Jack," she murmured to the photograph, tears rolling down her cheeks again. The strong June wind made the mansion's windows rattle, as if the house itself knew that its deepest secrets were about to come to light. Mary finished, cleaning in silence, but her mind was buzzing with questions and a growing determination. That night, in her small room at the back of the house, she lay awake, listening to the gentle rain tapping on the window, planning how to uncover the truth about Jack and why he pretended not to know her. She didn't yet know that the truth would be far more painful than any lie she could imagine. The basement of the Montgomery mansion was a place that Mary avoided whenever possible. The smell of mold and dampness, mixed with the aroma of mothballs from clothes, stored for decades, created a heavy atmosphere that caused an inexplicable tightness in her chest. But on that grey July morning, Mrs. Montgomery had been specific. The old boxes needed to be organized to make space for the winter decorations. "Mary, separate what can be donated and what should stay," the employer had said, handing her a typewritten list with detailed instructions. "My husband is very attached to family memories." The phrase sounded ironic to Mary's ears. What family memories could a man who grew up in a home possibly have? Unless he had completely erased his past, creating An entire story about a privileged childhood. The basement was divided into several sections, one area with furniture covered by white sheets, another with gym equipment that looked like it had never been used, and a third section where dozens of cardboard boxes were piled up, some so old they were starting to crumble at the edges. Mary started with the pile closest to the stairs, carefully opening a box marked Documents 1995. Inside, she found old work contracts, receipts, and some photographs of architectural works. Nothing that revealed any clues about Edward's past. It was in the fifth box, marked simply personal, that she found what would change everything. Among framed diplomas and professional certificates, there was a small shoebox tied with a faded string. Mary nervously glanced at the stairs, making sure she was alone before opening it with trembling hands. The first thing she saw was a yellowed ID card, featuring a much younger Edward. But the name on the document made her stagger. Jack Silver. The same name as the boy from the home, not Edward Montgomery as everyone knew. "Oh my God," she whispered, covering her mouth with her free hand. But it was the next photograph that nearly made her faint. It was a black and white photo, clearly taken at St. Vincent's home. Jack was in the center, thin and serious, wearing a striped T-shirt that she remembered perfectly. Beside him, smiling shyly, was a woman in her 30s whom Mary recognized immediately. "Sister Mary," she murmured, recalling the nun who took care of the kitchen at the home and always had a special affection for the older orphans. But it wasn't that which left her breathless. It was the woman appearing behind them, a volunteer kitchen helper wearing a white apron and a gentle smile. A woman whom Mary had seen every day for the past 2 months, working in the kitchen of the neighboring house. Rose. Mary's heart raced. Rose worked as a cook for the Silvera family, a wealthy family living in the mansion next door. Mary greeted her every morning when they both arrived for work around the same time, but they had never conversed beyond good morning and comments about the weather. Now everything was starting to make sense. The way Rose sometimes looked at her with a strange, almost melancholic expression, how she seemed to want to say something, but always fell silent at the last moment. How her eyes filled with tears when she saw Mary tending to the garden at the back of the house. Mary quickly snapped a photo of the image with her old cell phone, put everything back in the box, and hurried up from the basement. She needed to talk to Rose, and she needed to do it without raising suspicions. The opportunity arose that very afternoon. It was Thursday, the day when both had a few hours off, and the traditional St. Peter's festival was taking place in the little square. In front of the houses, the colourful flags fluttered in the cold wind, and the smell of roasted pine nuts and hot cider lingered in the air. Mary approached the makeshift bar where Rose was buying a cup of steaming hot cider. "Hi, Rose," she said, trying to sound casual despite her nervousness. "What a beautiful party, right?" Rose turned, and Mary immediately saw the surprise in her eyes. At 55, Rose was a sturdy woman with greying hair tied up in a bun and calloused hands from working since childhood. But there was a softness in her face that contrasted with the hardness of life that showed in her hands. "Hi, Mary," she replied, her voice slightly tense. Do you want some hot cider? It's really cold." "I'll take some, thanks." They moved away from the crowd, finding a more secluded spot near a tree, adorned with twinkling lights. Mary gathered her courage and decided to get straight to the point. "Rose, can I ask you a strange question?" The cook nearly dropped her cup. "What kind of question?" "Have you ever worked in a shelter or an orphanage?" Rose's face visibly paled, even under the yellow light of the party's decorations. She looked around as if afraid someone might be listening. "Why do you ask that?" she whispered. Mary took a deep breath and decided to go all in. "Because I grew up in St. Vincent's home in Springfield, and today I found an old photo where you appear." Rose shut her eyes tightly and sighed deeply, as if a weight of decades could finally be released. "Oh my God," she murmured. "I knew you would find out sooner or later." "So it's true? Do you know Edward, or rather Jack? Mary, you have no idea what I've been through all these years," Rose said, tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. "When I started working here in the neighborhood 5 years ago and saw Edward, I nearly had a heart attack. I recognized him right away." "And why didn't you say anything?" Rose nervously glanced at the houses around them, then leaned closer to Mary. "Because he asked me not to tell. In fact, he begged me." The music from the St. Peter's party continued playing in the background, but for Mary, the world had stopped. "What do you mean?" "Shortly after I started working at the Silvera's house, he showed up at my door one night. He was desperate, Mary. He said he had built an entire life based on a lie, that he was respected, that he had a family, businesses, that if anyone found out about the shelter, he would lose everything. But why would life in the shelter be a source of shame?" "You know how this elite in Chicago is," Rose said bitterly. "They only accept you if you come from a silver spoon. Edward created an entire story about being born into a traditional family of architects, that his parents died in an accident when he was a teenager, and that he was raised by wealthy relatives. His wife, Helen, believes that version even today." Mary felt a lump in her throat. "And he never asked about me?" Rose's silence was more painful than any words. Finally, she whispered, "He did ask. He always asked. But I told him I never heard from you after you left the volunteer work at the shelter." "You lied to him?" "I did," Rose admitted, tears now flowing freely. "Because I was scared." "Scared of what?" "That he would ask you to leave if he knew you were here. Edward is desperate to keep the secrets buried. He threatened to fire me and spread that I was a problematic employee if I told anyone about his past." The revelation hit Mary like a punch. The Jack she knew, the sweet and protective boy, had become a man capable of threatening a simple woman to protect his facade. "But there's more, isn't there?" Mary asked, seeing the desperation in Rose's eyes. "You're hiding something else." Rose looked around once more, then leaned in so close that Mary could feel her warm breath against her ear. "Mary, you have to stop investigating. You don't know what could happen. Why are you so scared?" "Because Helen is not just a spoiled socialite," Rose whispered urgently. "She has very powerful connections in this city. Her father practically controls half of the public contracts in Chicago. If she finds out her husband lied about everything, it won't just be the marriage that ends. She could completely destroy Edward's life." The party music seemed to fade further away. Mary felt she was being pulled into a much deeper and more dangerous abyss than she had imagined. "And there's one more thing you need to know," Rose continued, her voice almost inaudible. "Edward wasn't the only one from the shelter who was adopted back then." "What do you mean?" "There were 2 children on the adoption list that day. He was chosen. The other child remained." Mary's heart stopped. "Who was the other child?" Rose looked at her with eyes full of pain and guilt. "It was you, Mary, you." The hot cider fell from Mary's hands and spilled onto the grass, steaming on the cold ground. The party around her continued, people laughing and dancing, but she felt completely disconnected from reality. "I was there when the family came," Rose continued relentlessly. "They wanted a younger child, but they were torn between you two. In the end, they chose Jack because he was a boy, and they thought it would be easier to carry on the family name." "You mean that—" Mary began, but the words got lost in her throat. "That you could have been their daughter too. You could have grown up as Edward's sister. You could have had the life he had." The revelation was too devastating to process. Mary leaned against the tree, her legs weak, the world spinning around her. Rose held her by the arm. Mary, promise me you won't do anything rash. This family has a lot of power, and you are just an employee. If they want to destroy you, they will succeed." But Mary was no longer listening. Her mind was back at St. Vincent's home on that September morning 40 years ago, when Jack waved goodbye from the car window. She had stayed by the window for hours afterward, waiting for him to return, hoping he would realize he had forgotten something important. He had forgotten her. And now she was discovering that they could have been chosen together, that they could have grown up as siblings, that all the pain of separation could have been avoided. "Mary," Rose called, concerned, "are you okay?" "No," Mary replied, straightening up with a new and dangerous determination in her eyes. "I'm not okay, but I will be." Because one thing was becoming clear to her. It wasn't just the past that was being hidden. There were much bigger secrets being kept in that mansion, and she was determined to uncover them all, no matter the cost. The Chicago winter was just beginning, but Mary felt that a much bigger storm was brewing on the horizon. August arrived in Chicago with its characteristic chill, bringing frosty mornings that made breath turn to vapor and sunny afternoons that deceived anyone daring enough to go out without a coat. In the Montgomery mansion, the routine seemed normal on the surface, but Mary felt a growing tension in the air, like the electricity that precedes a storm. It had been 3 weeks since her revealing conversation with Rose at the St. Peter's party, and since then she'd been observing every movement, every glance, every whispered word between Edward and Helen. The couple was clearly troubled by something, and Mary suspected that her presence in the house was the reason. "Mary, I need you to clean Mr. Edward's office today," Helen said on a particularly cold morning, adjusting her cashmere shawl over her shoulders. "He'll be working at the construction site all day, so you'll have the freedom to organize everything properly." The boss spoke casually, but Mary noticed the nervousness in her voice. Helen rarely allowed any staff member to enter Edward's private office. That was sacred territory, where he kept his most important projects and personal documents. "Of course, Mrs. Montgomery, is there anything specific you want me to do?" "Just organize the papers on the desk, dust the shelves, and pay attention if you find any loose documents. Mr. Edward has been very disorganized lately." The last sentence sounded like a test, a carefully laid trap. Mary simply nodded, but inside her mind was racing. Helen was clearly trying to find out if she was snooping through Edward's belongings. The office was located on the second floor of the mansion, in a spacious room overlooking the backyard garden. It was a masculine and elegant environment. Dark wood-paneled walls, a mahogany executive desk, shelves filled with books on architecture and urban planning, and several plants that Helen insisted on keeping always green. Mary began cleaning methodically, but her attention was focused on the papers scattered across the desk. Construction contracts, architectural plans, budgets. Nothing that seemed relevant at first glance. It was when she moved a stack of specialized magazines that she found something interesting. It was an old phone book with a worn leather cover. Mary flipped through it quickly and found several notes in Edward's handwriting, but it was a specific page that caught her attention. In the A section, there was a name that made her heart race. St. Vincent's Home, Sister Mary Conceição. Next to the name, a phone number and a recent date, July 15th, 3 weeks ago, exactly the day after the St. Peter's party. "He called Sister Mary," Mary whispered, photographing the page with her phone. "He's investigating his past. Or mine." She continued rummaging through the desk more carefully, and under a folder she found a plain brown envelope with no identification. Inside were several photographs and documents that made her hands tremble. The first photo was of St. Vincent's home, but it was not an old image. It was recent, taken with a cell phone, showing the renovated facade of the institution. There were other photos. of the inner courtyard, of the dormitory where she and Jack had slept, even of the Suriname cherry tree where they used to hide to talk. But it was the documents that truly shook her. Copies of birth certificates, adoption files, social reports, all related to the time she and Jack had spent at the home. And at the end of the pile, a typewritten list with names and addresses of former staff members of the home, including Rose. "My God," Mary murmured, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place in her mind. "He's investigating everyone who knows the truth." That was when she heard the sound of the front door opening downstairs, followed by Edward's deep voice talking to someone. "It can't go on like this, Helen. She's suspicious." "I warned you it was dangerous to hire a maid without complete references," Helen replied, her voice heavy with irritation. "You should have been more careful." Mary quickly tucked the documents back into the envelope and continued cleaning, her heart pounding. The voices rose through the hall, and she managed to catch fragments of the conversation. "I hired a private investigator," Edward was saying. "He's already gotten information about her past. And she really grew up in the home. She stayed there until she was 18, then worked in several houses in the metropolitan area. Clean record, no issues with the law." "That doesn't reassure me, Edward. The fact that she grew up in the same place as you can't be a coincidence." Mary moved closer to the door, trying to hear better. The hallway was silent, and she could catch every word. "Maybe it really is a coincidence," Edward said, but his voice didn't sound convincing. "Chicago isn't that big, and she's been working as a maid for decades. It was only a matter of time until she ended up working in your house. Edward, for God's sake, do you think I'm an idiot?" There was a tense pause. Mary moved even closer to the door, holding her breath. "I called the nun who runs the home," Edward finally admitted. "Sister Mary. And," she confirmed, "there was a girl there with that name, a girl who was close to me." "Close how?" "She took care of me. She was like an older sister." Mary had to hold on to the wall. So he remembered her. After all these years, all the deception, all the denial, he still remembered. "Edward, do you understand the gravity of the situation?" Helen continued, her voice rising an octave. "If she decides to tell someone about the home, about her real origins, our social life is over. You've lost important contracts, I'll be humiliated at the club, and Matthew will suffer at school." I know, but I can't just fire her without cause. That would raise even more suspicions. Then create a reason." The silence that followed was deafening. Mary felt cold sweat trickling down her back despite the winter chill in Chicago. "Helen, are you suggesting that I'm suggesting you protect our family. You have a business to run, I have my social standing to maintain, and our son has a future ahead. This woman is a threat to all of that. She has never done anything wrong." "Not yet, but do you want to wait and see?" "Edward, you know my father. You know the connections he has in this city. One word from him in the right places, and any domestic worker could find themselves out of work permanently in Chicago." The threat was as clear as the ice forming on the mansion's windows. Mary felt a mix of fear and anger growing in her chest. Helen was not just protecting her husband's secrets, she was willing to destroy an innocent woman's life to maintain her social position. "No," Edward finally said, and there was a firmness in his voice that Mary did not expect. "I won't do that to her. I've done enough wrong in the past." "What wrong? What are you talking about?" There was another pause, longer this time. Mary could imagine Edward struggling with himself, deciding how much of the truth he should tell his wife. "When we were adopted," he started but did not finish the sentence. "When you were adopted." "You who, Edward?" "Nothing, forget it, it was misinterpreted." But Helen was too sharp to let it go. "Edward, you're hiding something from me, and I will find out what it is." The footsteps approached the stairs, and Mary, quickly rushed back to the table, pretending to organize the papers. Her hands trembled, not only from fear, but from a growing anger that began to burn in her chest. Jack, or Edward, as he had chosen to call himself, remembered her. He knew exactly who she was from the very first day, and yet he pretended not to know her, lied to her, treated her like a stranger. But more than that, he had allowed her to continue working in the house, knowing the risk it posed to both of them. Why? Guilt, nostalgia, or was there nostalgia? Or something deeper that he could not admit even to himself? Mary finished tidying up the office in silence, but her mind was racing with plans. The conversation she had just overheard confirmed her worst suspicions. Helen was dangerous and had enough power to destroy her life. Edward was torn between protecting the false past he had built and some kind of lingering loyalty or affection for the girl she had once been. But there was something neither of them yet knew. Mary was no longer the scared girl from the home. She'd become a strong woman who had survived decades of rejection and hardship, and she was beginning to realize that she might have more power in this situation than she had imagined. Because if Edward wanted to keep his secrets buried, he needed her as much as she needed the truth. And the truth, Mary was discovering, could be a very powerful weapon in the right hands. When she finished her work and descended the stairs, she found Edward in the living room, gazing thoughtfully out the window at the garden, where the hydrangeas were beginning to show the first signs of the approaching spring. He turned when he heard her enter, and for a moment their eyes met. In that instant, Mary saw not the successful and respected architect, but the scared boy from the home, the Jack who used to have nightmares and woke in the middle of the night searching for her hand. "The office is organized, Mr. Edward," she said calmly. "Thank you, Mary," he replied, and there was something in his voice, a weight, a sadness, that confirmed to her that the battle between the past and the present was just beginning, and this time she was determined to win. September brought to Chicago that characteristic mix of morning chill and afternoon warmth that signaled the arrival of spring. However, the internal atmosphere in the Montgomery mansion remained tense and cold. Mary had noticed subtle changes in the household routine. Edward was leaving earlier and returning later. Helen was making whispering calls at odd hours, and Matthew, their teenage son, seemed restless and suspicious. "Mary, we're going to renovate my husband's office," Helen announced on a rainy Thursday, nervously adjusting the diamond ring on her finger. "He wants to modernize the space. The contractors will start on Monday." The mistress spoke, as if it were a routine decision, but Mary noted the urgency in her voice. Ever since she had overheard the couple's conversation a few weeks earlier, she had been watching every movement with heightened attention. "Do you want me to help pack Mr. Edward's belongings?" Mary asked, trying to sound casual. "No," Helen replied too quickly, then composed herself. "I mean, it won't be necessary. My husband is already organizing the important documents. You just need to worry about keeping the house clean during the renovation." On Sunday night, the eve of the renovation, Mary watched Edward leave the office carrying several cardboard boxes. He took them to the couple's bedroom, but some hours later, she saw him coming down again with two smaller boxes, heading towards the basement. On Monday morning, the construction workers arrived early, 3 sturdy and friendly men, led by a foreman named Mr. Anthony, a gentleman in his 60s with a grey moustache and an easy smile. "Good morning, ma'am," greeted Mary as she served them coffee. "Have you been working here long?" "Just a few months," she replied, watching the men examine the office walls with small hammers. "What a beautiful house, right?" commented one of the helpers, a young man named David. "It must be expensive to maintain all of this." "The boss is an architect," Mary explained. "He likes things done well." "Ah, so he knows what he's doing." Mr. Anthony laughed. "That makes our job easier." Throughout the morning, Mary watched the workers at their tasks. They were removing part of the wooden paneling from one wall to install new built-in shelves. Helen had gone out for her usual social activities, and Edward was in a meeting downtown. It was David who made the discovery that would change everything. "Mr. Anthony," the young man shouted around 10 in the morning, "come see this." Mary, who was cleaning the nearby hallway, discreetly approached to observe. "What is it, boy?" asked the foreman, moving closer to the wall where David was working. "Look, there's a hole here behind the wood. It looks like it was made on purpose, you know, like it's a hiding spot." Mr. Anthony examined the discovery with interest. Behind the wooden panel, there was indeed a hollow space, and inside it, a well-sealed plastic envelope. "It must be important documents that someone wanted to protect," concluded the foreman. "Better call the boss." "He's not home," Mary said, stepping closer, "but I can keep it to give to him when he returns." The workers exchanged glances, clearly uncertain. It was David who seemed most uncomfortable with the situation. "Ma'am, with all due respect, but a document hidden like this, maybe it's better to let him see it himself." Of course, Mary quickly agreed. "You're right. I'll call him." But as she stepped into the hallway and pretended to dial Edward's number, her mind was racing. That envelope hadn't been there by chance. Edward had hidden it on purpose, and now the workers had found it. In a few hours, when he returned, those documents, whatever they were, would disappear forever. She went back to the office and found the men still debating what to do. "I spoke with Mr. Edward," Mary lied. "He said you can leave the envelope on the desk. He'll look at it when he gets back." Mr. Anthony hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed. "All right. But you need to sign here on our report that you received the envelope, okay? We don't want any trouble later." Mary signed the paper without hesitation. When the workers returned to their tasks, she took the envelope with trembling hands and ran to the second-floor bathroom, locking the door behind her. The plastic envelope was well preserved, and inside were several documents that made Mary's heart nearly stop. The first was an original birth certificate, the true birth certificate of Jack Montgomery, born on March 15, 1979, to an unknown mother. Next to it was a second copy of the same certificate, but with evident alterations. The name had been changed to Edward Montgomery, son of Carlos Edward Montgomery and Maria Montgomery, both deceased. "Forgery," Mary murmured, quickly photographing the documents with her cell phone. There were also adoption papers, but not the official ones. They were drafts, handwritten notes that told a story very different from the version Edward presented to the world. According to those documents, Jack had been adopted at the age of 12 by a middle-class family from Chicago, the Montgomerys. But they weren't the traditional architects he always claimed. Carlos Montgomery was a building technician, and Maria was a primary school teacher. Honest, hard-working people, but definitely not the elite Edward pretended to come from. But it was the last document that truly shook Mary. It was a handwritten letter, clearly written by a child, with shaky handwriting and many spelling mistakes. "Dear Mary, I'm leaving today, but I don't want to. The new parents seem nice, but I wanted to stay with you. I promise that when I grow up, I will come back to get you. You are my real sister, and I will never forget. Your brother forever, Jack P.S. I hid a candy under your pillow." Tears began to roll down Mary's face as she reread the letter several times. She vaguely remembered finding a guava candy under her pillow the day Jack left, but at the time she thought it had been one of the nuns. There was one more sheet of paper, this one typed and official. It was a social report from the home, and a specific paragraph caught her attention. "The minor Mary Santos Montgomery demonstrates a strong emotional bond with the minor Jack Montgomery. They both consider themselves siblings and exhibit protective behavior towards each other. Separation may cause significant psychological trauma, especially for the minor, who already shows signs of abandonment anxiety. Joint adoption is recommended whenever possible. Siblings, Mary whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. We were practically siblings. She quickly photographed all the documents, put them back in the envelope and returned to the office. The workers were focused on their tasks, removing more panels from the wall. "Did you find anything interesting?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "No, ma'am," Mr. Anthony replied, "but this wall really was full of surprises. Whoever built this made sure to create several hidden spaces." Mary placed the envelope on Edward's desk, exactly where the workers had left it, but now she knew all the secrets it contained. For the rest of the day, she could hardly concentrate on her work. Her mind kept drifting back to Jack's letter, to the words, "my real sister," to the... He had tried to fulfill the promise of returning, even if in a distorted and painful way. Edward arrived home in the late afternoon, visibly tense. Mary watched him rush up the stairs directly to the office. A few minutes later, she heard him talking loudly with Helen in the couple's bedroom. "The workers found..." She managed to catch fragments of the discussion. "How could you be foolish enough to hide?" Helen's voice sounded furious. "I need to know if she saw..." Edward seemed desperate. At dinner that Mary served in the dining room, she observed the couple. Edward barely touched his food. His green eyes, so familiar, were red from exhaustion and worry. Helen maintained a mask of normalcy, but her hands trembled slightly as she brought the fork to her mouth. It was Matthew, the couple's son, who broke the tense silence. "Dad, the workers said they found a hidden treasure in the wall," the teenager said with typical youthful curiosity. "Is it true?" Edward nearly choked on his wine. "It was. Nothing important, Matthew. Just old work papers." "What kind of papers?" "Matthew," Helen interjected, her voice sharp, "don't be impertinent. Your father's work matters are none of your concern." The boy looked from his father to his mother, clearly sensing that something was off. At 16, Matthew was smart and observant, traits he had inherited from his father. Mary noticed he had been paying more attention to the tensions in the house lately. After dinner, while washing the dishes in the kitchen, Mary heard Edward approaching. "Mary," he said, and there was something different in his voice, a vulnerability she hadn't heard since the days at St. Vincent's home. Did you see the documents the workers found today?" She turned slowly, drying her hands on her apron. For the first time since she started working in the house, Edward was looking directly into her eyes, without pretense, without masks. "I saw that they found an envelope," she replied carefully. "But you didn't open it to see what it was." Mary took a deep breath. It was time to decide what game she was going to play. She could lie, pretend innocence, maintain the disguise, or she could start demanding the promises made 40 years ago by a scared boy. "I didn't open it," she lied, deciding it wasn't yet the time for the complete truth. "But Mr. Edward, may I ask a question?" He nodded, clearly relieved that she hadn't seen the documents. "Why do you never talk about your family, about your childhood?" The question hit him like a bullet. Edward turned pale, his hands clenched into fists, the same nervous gesture he had when he was a child. "Because," he finally said, his voice almost a whisper, "some parts of the past hurt too much to remember, even when there are people from the past we miss." Edward's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Mary saw again the boy from St. Vincent's home, vulnerable and scared. "Especially then," he murmured, and he quickly left the kitchen, leaving Mary alone with her discoveries and the growing certainty that Edward knew exactly who she was, and that the pain of separation had marked his life as much as it had marked hers. Spring was coming to Chicago, but in the Montgomery mansion, the winter of secrets and lies seemed only to be beginning to melt. October painted Chicago pink with the blooming of the cherry blossoms, but inside the Montgomery mansion, the atmosphere remained charged with unspoken tensions. Mary had been observing subtle changes in everyone's behavior. Edward avoided being alone with her. Helen made whispered phone calls in French, a language Mary didn't understand but recognized as a strategy to keep secrets. And Matthew had started asking strange questions about the family history. It was on a particularly sunny Tuesday morning that Mary's life changed forever. Helen had left for a golf club meeting. Edward was supervising a construction project downtown, and Matthew had classes at university. The house was silent, only the sound of birds in the garden and the distant noise of traffic on Battelle Avenue. Mary was organizing the library when she found a photo book that had slipped behind the shelf. As she tried to reposition it, her trembling hands dropped the album, scattering old photos across the floor. She knelt to pick them up, and it was then that she saw an image that made her world completely crumble. It was a black and white photo, clearly from the 1980s, showing a family in a garden of a simple yet cozy house. In the center, a young couple smiled at the camera, a dark-haired man in glasses and a blonde woman in a floral dress. Between them, two children, a boy of about 12 with familiar green eyes, and a slightly older girl, thin and serious. Mary picked up the photo with trembling hands and examined it more closely. The boy was unmistakably Jack, or Edward, but the girl... "Oh my God," she murmured, bringing her free hand to her mouth. The girl in the photo was her. Mary rushed to the living room mirror and compared her features with those of the child in the photograph. The same almond-shaped eyes, the same face shape, the same serious and cautious expression. There was no doubt. She was in that family photo. But how was that possible? She had never left St. Vincent's home to visit families. The rules were strict. Children only left the institution permanently when they were adopted. There were no visits or trial periods in temporary families. With her heart racing, she turned the photo over. On the back, delicate feminine handwriting had written, "Montgomery family, Christmas 1991. Carlos, Maria, Jack and Mary, our first celebration together." The world began to spin around Mary. Montgomery family, Carlos and Maria Montgomery, Jack's adoptive parents according to the documents she had found. But why was she in the photo? Why not? Do you remember that Christmas? That house, that family? Her legs gave way, and she sat heavily on the leather sofa in the living room, still holding the photograph. Fragments of memories began to emerge from the depths of her mind, like pieces of a puzzle she had forced herself to forget. She vaguely remembered leaving St. Vincent's home on a December afternoon, accompanied by a social worker. She recalled a house that smelled of orange cake, a blonde woman who hugged her and cried, and a kind man who showed her a small but cozy room with 2 beds. "You will be real siblings now," the woman had said. "A real family." The memories came in painful flashes. Jack holding her hand at the first dinner, the two exploring the backyard of the house, playing with a mutt named Mel. She remembered the feeling of safety, of finally belonging somewhere. But why had she returned to the home? What had happened to that family? Why had she completely blocked those memories? Mary rushed to the phone and dialed the number she knew by heart. Sister Mary, who still worked at St. Vincent's home. "Sister Mary, it's Mary. Mary Santos. I really need to talk to you." The warm voice of the nun on the other end of the line showed surprise and joy. "My daughter. What a joy to hear from you. How are you? I heard you are working in a good home. Sister, I need you to tell me something very important. Did I live with a family temporarily? The Montgomerys?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Sister Mary finally spoke, her voice was heavy with sadness. "Oh, my daughter, you remembered. So it's true. I lived with them?" "Yes, you did. It was 6 blessed months. The Montgomery couple wanted to adopt both of you, you and Jack. You were so happy. You were a beautiful family." Mary felt tears streaming down her face. "What happened, sister? Why did I come back?" The nun's sigh echoed through the phone. "Because Helen Montgomery found out she was impregnant, dear. After years of trying to have children, God sent them a baby, and Carlos lost his job around the same time. They could no longer afford to adopt 2 children." "But why did I come back alone? Why did Jack stay?" "Because you made a choice, my girl, a choice that only a generous soul like yours could make." Mary could barely breathe. "What choice?" "When the Montgomerys explained the situation, you said that Jack was more adjusted, that he was younger and needed a family more. You asked to return to the home alone so that he could stay." The revelation hit Mary like a lightning bolt. She remembered now, not the decision itself, but the overwhelming pain of returning to the home, of leaving behind the feeling of having a house, a family, a brother. "Sister, why didn't I remember this?" "Because you were very young and the pain was too great. The psychologist at the home said it was normal for you to have blocked those memories. You became very withdrawn when you returned. It took years for you to trust people again." Mary hung up the phone and sat in the living room, staring at the photo of the family she had chosen to leave behind. Jack, Edward, not only knew who she was, he knew that she had sacrificed her own chance of having a family so that he could have his, and he had hired her as a maid. The anger that began to burn in her chest was different from anything she had ever felt. It was not just the pain of rejection or deceit. It was the fury of realizing that her childhood generosity had not only been ignored, but cruelly exploited. It was at that moment that Edward came home earlier than usual. Mary heard him enter through the front door, greet the doorman, and climb the stairs. When he entered the living room and saw her holding the photograph, his face instantly paled. "Mary, I can explain." "Can you?" She slowly stood up, the photo still in her hands. "Can you explain how you had the courage to hire me as a maid, knowing that I sacrificed my own family so you could have yours?" Edward closed his eyes, his hands trembling. "I didn't plan this. When Helen said she was going to hire a new maid, I didn't even know it was you. I only found out when I got home on the first day." "And why didn't you say anything? Why did you pretend not to know me?" "Because," he shouted, then lowered his voice, nervously glancing at the stairs. "Because I was ashamed. Ashamed to have had the life that was supposed to be yours too. Ashamed to have become everything I became while I what? Remained just a maid." "That's not it. It's that I always knew I should have looked for you. I should have shared everything with you. But the longer time went on, the more impossible it became. How would I explain it to Helen, to Matthew? How would I tell them that my whole story was a lie?" Mary took a few steps toward him, and Edward instinctively backed away. "Do you know what is crueler, Jack?" she said, deliberately using his childhood name. "It's not you pretending not to know me. It's not even you building an entire life based on lies. Then what is it? It's you letting me work as a maid in the house that was supposed to be mine too, seeing every day the life I gave up so you could have." Edward began to cry, silent tears streaming down his still, handsome and well-groomed face. "Mary, forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. But please, forgive me. I could never forget you. Never. I managed to forget what you did for me. If you never managed to forget, why didn't you ever come looking for me? Why did you wait for chance to bring us together?" "Because I am a coward," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Because I built an entire life based on lies and didn't have the courage to face the truth. Because the more success I had, the more ashamed I felt that you weren't here with me." Mary looked at the man in front of her. No longer the respected architect, but the scared boy from the home she had protected so many times. And for the first time since she discovered the truth, she felt something beyond anger. She felt a deep sadness for the child he had been, for the fear that had turned him into a liar, for the loneliness he must have felt all those years knowing he had left behind the only person who truly loved him unconditionally. "Edward," she finally said, "do you have any idea what Helen will do when she discovers the truth? Because she will find out. People like her always do. I know, and I am prepared for the consequences." "Are you really? Are you prepared to lose everything? The company, your social standing, maybe even your own son?" Edward looked at her with a mix of despair and determination. "If that's the price to finally do the right thing, yes, I am prepared." Mary nodded slowly, tucking the photograph into her apron pocket. "Then you'd better start preparing for real, because Helen has arrived." The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, followed by the voice of the mistress calling for her husband. Edward and Mary exchanged glances, both knowing that the storm approaching would be unlike anything they had ever faced. Spring was blooming outside, but inside the Montgomery mansion, the cruelest winter was just beginning. Helen climbed the stairs with the characteristic sound of her high heels on the marble, but stopped abruptly at the entrance of the living room upon seeing Edward and Mary standing, one in front of the other, with tense expressions that made it clear something important had happened. "What is going on here?" she asked, her icy blue eyes quickly darting between them. Helen Montgomery had grown up in the elite circles of Chicago and had developed a keen instinct for detecting problems that could threaten her social position. Edward swallowed hard, the words stuck in his throat. Mary remained still holding the photograph in her apron pocket, feeling the weight of 40 years of buried truths. "Helen, we need to talk," Edward finally said, his voice trembling. "Talk about what? And why is Mary here?" It was then that Mary made a decision that would change everything. She slowly took the photograph from her pocket and placed it on the coffee table. "Because this conversation is about me too, Mrs. Montgomery." Helen approached the table, looked at the photograph and frowned. "What photograph is this? Why are you looking at old pictures?" "Because," Mary said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed, "this is the photo of the family that raised me for 6 months, the same family that raised your husband." The silence that followed was deafening. Helen picked up the photograph with trembling hands, examined it carefully, looked at Edward, then at Mary, and finally understood the magnitude of the situation. "You two know each other," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You've known each other since childhood." "Yes," Edward confirmed, finally finding the courage to speak. "We grew up together at St. Vincent's home. She was like a sister to me." Helen let out a bitter laugh, devoid of humor. "A sister? How convenient. And when were you planning to tell me about this sister, Edward? When she had worked for us for 10 years? Helen, let me explain." "Explain what?" she shouted, losing the elegant composure she always maintained. "Explain that you lied about your entire background, that there is no traditional family of architects, that you came from an orphanage, that you hired a woman from your past without telling me." Mary watched the argument with a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. It was painful, but also liberating to see Edward's lies finally being exposed. "And you," Helen turned to Mary, her eyes shining with rage. "How long have you known who he is?" "Since the first day," Mary lied, deciding not to reveal the whole truth about her investigation. "I recognized him immediately." "And you accepted the job anyway? Why?" Mary took a deep breath. It was time to lay her cards on the table. Because I wanted to understand why the boy who once promised we were family forever let me work as a maid in the house that should have been mine too. The revelation hit Helen like a slap in the face. She turned to Edward with an expression of disbelief. What house that should have been hers too? What is she talking about? Edward ran a hand through his hair nervously, the same gesture from childhood. Helen, when the Montgomerys adopted us, they wanted to take us both. Mary and I lived with them for 6 months. Both of you, Helen repeated, her voice rising an octave. But then they found out they couldn't keep both children. And Mary chose to go back to the home so that I could stay. Helen looked from Edward to Mary, slowly processing the implications of that revelation. When she finally understood, her expression transformed into a mask of cold fury. "You mean," she said, slowly, "that this woman gave up her own adoption so that you could have a family, and you hired her as a domestic worker?" "It wasn't intentional. I didn't know it was her when you said you were going to hire, but you knew when she got here, and still let her continue working, serving our table, cleaning our bathrooms, washing our clothes." Edward could no longer look either woman in the eye. The shame he had carried for decades was finally being exposed. All of her cruelty. It was then that a young voice echoed down the hallway. "Mom, Dad, why are you shouting?" Matthew appeared at the doorway, still in his university uniform, backpack slung over his shoulder. At 16, he was a smart and observant boy who had been noticing the rising tensions at home. "Matthew, go back to your room," Helen said quickly. "No," Edward said, surprising everyone. "He has the right to know the truth." "Edward, no!" Helen protested. But Edward had already made his decision. He looked at his son, then at Mary, and finally found the courage he should have had 40 years ago. "Matthew, sit down. I need to tell you some things about our family." The teenager slowly sat down, looking curiously at the tense adults around him. "Son, everything you know about my childhood is a lie. I didn't grow up in a traditional family of architects. I grew up in a home in Springfield along with Mary." Matthew looked at the housekeeper with wide eyes. "Mary? She was like a sister to me for years. And when we had a chance to be adopted together, she gave up her own adoption so I could have a family." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of birds. In the garden, Matthew processed the information, looking from one adult to another. "So," he finally said, "Mary is like my aunt?" The simplicity of the question and the teenager's natural acceptance made Edward cry. "Yes," he sighed, "she should have been your aunt. She should have been part of our family all along." Helen exploded. "Edward, have you completely lost your mind? You're destroying our family, our reputation, everything we've built." "Our reputation was built on lies, Helen. And you think that matters? Do you think the truth will feed our family? Will it keep your contracts? Will it ensure our son's education?" Mary, who had remained silent during the discussion, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Montgomery, may I ask a question?" Helen turned to her, her eyes flashing with anger. "What do you want? Do you really believe that a life built on lies can bring true happiness to a family? Don't come at me with cheap philosophy. You don't understand anything about our social position, about the responsibilities we have." "I understand more than you can imagine," Mary calmly replied. "I understand what it's like to grow up without family, without a name, without social standing. I understand what it's like to work since childhood to survive. And I also understand what it means to give up your own happiness so that someone you love can have a chance." Helen was momentarily speechless, but quickly regained her composure. "Very touching. But that doesn't change anything. I won't allow you to destroy my family." "I'm not the one destroying it," Mary said softly. "It's the lies you all built. I'm just here when they finally crumble." It was Matthew who broke the rising tension. "Mary, he said, standing up and approaching her. "You really gave up your family, so my dad could have won?" "Yes," she simply replied. The teenager hugged her, surprising everyone. "Thank you," he whispered in her ear. "Thank you for giving my dad a family, even if it meant you'd be alone." The simple and sincere gesture from the boy broke something inside Mary. All the decades of pain, loneliness, and questioning whether she had made the right choice dissolved in that innocent embrace. Helen watched the scene with growing horror, realizing she was losing control of the situation. "This is ridiculous," she exploded. "Matthew, get away from her right now." "Why?" the teenager asked, genuinely confused. "She's family. She's a housekeeper. She's the woman who sacrificed everything so I could have a father," Matthew retorted with a maturity that surprised the adults present. Helen looked around, at her crying husband, at her son hugging the housekeeper, at the woman who represented everything she feared, the truth about the humble origins of her perfect family. "Very well," she finally said, her voice cold and controlled. "If you want the truth, you will have the truth, but you will also face the consequences." She headed for the door, then turned one last time. "Edward, you have 24 hours to choose. Either she leaves this house and our lives forever, or I will leave, and I will take Matthew with me." The threat hung in the air as Helen ascended the stairs, the sound of her heels echoing like a countdown to a final explosion. In the living room, Edward, Mary, and Matthew remained silent, each processing the ultimatum that would change their lives forever. The autumn in Chicago painted the trees in the garden gold, but inside the Montgomery mansion, the cruelest winter of all their lives was just beginning. The night that followed Helen's ultimatum was the longest Edward had spent in decades. Mary returned to her small room at the back of the house, but neither of them could sleep. For the first time since she started working there, the mansion was completely silent. Not even the usual sound of the couple's television could be heard. Helen had locked herself in the master bedroom and did not come down for dinner. Matthew, still processing the day's revelations, had tried several times to talk to his mother, but she refused to open the door. Edward spent the night walking the halls of the house, looking at the pictures on the walls, at the expensive furniture, at all the luxury he had built over the years. For the first time, it all seemed empty and artificial to him. At 6 in the morning on Thursday, when Mary came down to prepare breakfast, as she always did, she found him sitting in the kitchen, still wearing the clothes from the day before. "Good morning," she said softly, avoiding looking directly into his eyes. "Good morning, Mary. Did you sleep?" "Not much. And you?" "Not at all." She began to prepare the coffee in silence, following the morning routine that had become natural over the past few months. Edward watched her, noticing for the first time how efficient and careful her movements were, how she knew every detail of the kitchen, how she had perfectly integrated into that house that should have been hers too. "Mary," he finally said, "I've made my decision." She stopped stirring the sugar in the coffee and turned to face him. "What decision?" "I'm going to tell Helen everything, the whole truth. About the home, about our childhood, about the adoption, about you. And I'm going to publicly ask for forgiveness for what I did." Mary slowly sat down in the chair across from him. "Do you understand what that means? It means I'll lose contracts, clients, maybe the whole company. It means Helen might really leave me and take Matthew. It means my reputation in Chicago will be ruined. And are you willing to pay that price?" Edward looked her in the eyes for the first time since they had reunited. "I'm willing to pay the price of finally doing the right thing, 40 years late, but still the right thing." Before Mary could respond, Helen came down the stairs. She was impeccably dressed, made up with perfect hair, as if nothing had happened the night before, but her red eyes betrayed the sleepless night. "Edward," she said coldly, "I hope you've come to a sensible decision." I have. Mary stays. She's family, always has been, and I should have recognized that 40 years ago. Helen approached the kitchen counter, leaning on it as if she needed physical support. So you've chosen a maid over your own family. She's not a maid, Helen. She's the woman who sacrificed her own adoption so that I could have a family. She's the most generous person I've ever known in my life, and I treated her in the worst possible way. Helen let out a bitter laugh. How touching! And how do you plan to explain this to your clients, to our friends, to the country club family? I'll tell the truth. The truth? Helen practically shouted. Edward, you are one of the most respected architects in Chicago. Your designs are in every elite home in the city. Do you think these people will continue hiring someone who has lied about his origins for decades? If they are decent people, they will understand. Decent people? Helen laughed again. Edward, you know nothing about the elite in this city. They do not forgive lies, especially lies about social origin. You will be professionally destroyed. Mary, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Mrs. Montgomery, may I suggest an alternative? They both turned to look at her. I will leave the house. You continue with your lives, and I will return to my previous life. No one needs to know anything. No, Edward said immediately. I'm not letting you leave again. I've made that mistake once. Edward, Mary said patiently, you have a family to protect, a son to raise, a company to maintain. I am just a woman alone in the world. I can start over anywhere. Helen looked from one to the other, seeing an opportunity. This is the most sensible solution, she quickly agreed. Mary leaves. We make sure she finds a better job in another city. Everyone is happy. Everyone but me, Edward said bitterly. Helen, you don't understand. Mary is not just someone from my past. She is the reason I had a family. The reason you met me, the reason we had Matthew, the reason we built our life. That's dramatic exaggeration, Edward. It's not exaggeration. If she hadn't given up her adoption, I would have gone back to the home too. The Montgomerys could only take one child, and if Mary hadn't sacrificed herself, they would have given up on both of us. The weight of that revelation hit Helen like a blow. She had never thought about the full implications of Mary's sacrifice. It was then that Matthew appeared in the kitchen, already dressed for university. "Good morning," he said, going straight to Mary and giving her a hug. "How did you sleep, Aunt Mary?" The natural use of the word aunt made Helen choke. "Matthew, don't call her that." "Why not, Mom? She is Dad's sister. That makes her my aunt." "She is not your father's sister." "She may not be biologically," Matthew retorted with the simple logic of teenagers, "but she was raised with him, took care of him, sacrificed her own family for him. If that doesn't make her family, then what does?" Helen looked at her son, realizing she was losing his support too. "Matthew, you don't understand the complications." "I understand that you built a life based on lies," the boy interrupted. "And I understand that when someone finally appears who represents the truth, you want to get rid of that person instead of facing your own lies." The maturity in her son's words left Helen momentarily speechless. Edward seized the silence. "Helen, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give an interview to the Chicago Tribune on Friday. I'm going to tell my real story, how I left the home, how Mary helped me, how I built my life. I'm going to publicly own my lies and ask for forgiveness. Edward, you've completely lost your mind. Maybe, but for the first time in 40 years, I'm going to be doing the right thing." Helen looked around the kitchen at her determined husband, at her son who looked at her with disappointment, at the woman who represented everything she feared losing. "Very well," she finally said, her voice as cold as a Chicago winter. If you want to destroy our family over a matter of conscience, go ahead, but don't expect me to be here to watch." She headed for the door, but before leaving, she turned one last time. "Edward, when you lose everything, and you will lose, don't come looking for me. And Matthew, when your university friends find out that your father is a liar and your family is a sham, don't come crying to me." After Helen left, silence filled the kitchen. Mary was processing the magnitude of what Edward was willing to sacrifice. Matthew seemed proud of his father, but also worried about the consequences. "Dad," the teenager finally said, "are you sure about this?" Edward looked at his son, then at Mary. "Son, for 40 years I've lived with shame about who I was and guilt for what I didn't do. It's time to live with pride in the truth, even if it comes at a cost." Mary stood up and placed her hand on Edward's shoulder. "Jack," she said, using his childhood name for the first time in front of Matthew, "you don't have to do this for me." "I'm not doing it for you," he replied. "I'm doing it for us, for the child you were, for the child I was, and for the family we should have always been." Outside, the trees in the garden were beginning to show the colors of autumn. But inside the Montgomery mansion's kitchen, something new was being born, the possibility of a family built not on lies and appearances, but on truth, sacrifice, and unconditional love. The storm was far from over, but for the first time in decades, Edward felt he was sailing in the right direction. Friday, November 15th, 2024. The sky over Chicago was overcast, as if the city itself sensed that something important was about to happen. In the newsroom of the Chicago Gazette, Edward Montgomery nervously adjusted his tie while waiting for the start of the interview that would change his life forever. The journalist responsible for the piece was Carla Smith, an experienced professional in her 40s, known for her investigative reports on the Chicago elite. She had been intrigued when Edward called requesting an interview to tell the truth about my origins. "Mr. Edward," Carla said, adjusting the recorder on the table, "are you sure you want to do this? Once the interview is published, there's no turning back." Edward looked out the newsroom window, watching the traffic on John Negron Street. In a few hours, all of Chicago would know who he really was. "I'm absolutely sure." The interview lasted 2 hours. Edward shared everything: his childhood at St. Vincent's home, his time with the Montgomery family, Mary's sacrifice, the lies he had built over the years, and finally, the reunion with her. "And how did Mrs. Helen react when she learned the truth?" Carla asked. She didn't take it well. She's worried about our reputation, about my career, and she has reason to be concerned." "Why did you decide to tell everything now?" Edward thought about the question for a long moment. "Because I realized that a life built on lies is not a life, it's just a performance. And I'm tired of acting." The interview was published the following Sunday, taking up 3 pages of the newspaper with the headline, "The Elite Architect Who Grew Up in a Shelter, the Story of Edward Montgomery." The repercussions were immediate and devastating. On Monday morning, the phone at home wouldn't stop ringing. Some were clients cancelling contracts, others were journalists asking for more details, and a few were people offering support. Mary watched Edward handle each call, seeing how he maintained his dignity even when he was insulted or humiliated on the other end of the line. "Mr. Edward," she said during a pause between calls, "you don't have to keep living here. I can leave. You can move to a smaller place, start over in another city." "Mary, how many times do I need to repeat? You are not leaving. This is your home as much as mine." It was then that Matthew arrived from university, visibly shaken. "Dad, I need to tell you something." Edward braced himself for the worst. "What happened at university?" "Some classmates saw the interview. Some laughed. Some made nasty comments about our family. Matthew, I'm sorry. I should have thought better before. Let me finish. The teenager interrupted. Some people laughed, but there were also those who approached me to say they admired your courage. A professor said your story is inspiring, and a classmate from architecture said your designs are even more impressive knowing where you came from. Edward felt a relief he hadn't expected. Really? Dad, do you think your talent as an architect changed because people know your origins? Do you think the buildings you've designed are any less beautiful? That the houses you've drawn are any less functional? The simplicity of his son's logic made Edward smile for the first time in days. You're right. And there's more, Matthew continued. I was ashamed that you lied for so many years, but I'm not ashamed of your origins. In fact, I'm proud. My dad grew up in a shelter and became one of the best architects in the city. That's incredible. Mary felt her eyes fill with tears upon hearing the boy's words. Matthew had understood something that many adults couldn't, that one's origins do not determine a person's worth. The following week brought surprises. Yes, Edward lost some important contracts, mainly with traditional families who felt deceived for hiring someone who pretended to be part of the elite. But he also received unexpected calls. The first was from an NGO that worked with affordable housing. Mr. Edward, we want to hire your services to design dignified homes for low-income families. Someone who grew up in vulnerable situations understands better what these families need. The second was from a construction company that specialized in social projects. We read your interview. We need an architect who designs not only with technique, but with social sensitivity. The third call was the most surprising of all. It was from Robert Smith, a Chicago businessman known for his investments in educational projects. Edward, I grew up in the same shelter as you, but 10 years earlier. I read your interview and want to propose a partnership. How about we create a vocational education program for young people who are leaving the system? From the shelter? Edward could hardly believe it. You're also from St. Vincent's. I am. And just like you, I lied about my background for years. Your courage to tell the truth inspired me to do the same. On Thursday of that week, Helen finally returned home. She had spent the last few days at her parents' house in the Heights and came back with a serious but no longer hostile expression. Edward, we need to talk. They sat in the living room where, just 2 weeks earlier, the truth had exploded for the first time. Helen, if you came back to ask for a divorce— I didn't come back to ask for a divorce, she interrupted him. I came back because our son made me think about some things. Matthew? He called me every day this week. And do you know what he said yesterday? He said he was proud of his dad, for the first time in his life, not because of professional success or social status, but because you finally had the courage to be true. Edward didn't know what to say. Edward, I'm still furious with you for lying all these years. I'm furious that I found out in the worst possible way, and I'm scared of what this will mean for our social life. I understand, but I also realize one thing. If I leave you because of this, I will be sending a terrible message to our son. I will be saying that appearances matter more than truth, and I don't want him to grow up believing that. Helen stood up and walked to the window, looking at the garden where Mary tended to the flowers. And there's another thing, she continued. I spent these days researching about Mary. I looked into the families she worked for, talked to some people. Do you know what I discovered? What? That she is one of the most honest people who ever worked in this area. All her employers praised her honesty, dedication, and discretion. One of them said that Mary found a wallet with a lot of money forgotten in a drawer and returned it intact. Another said she cared for a sick child as if it were her own. Edward felt his chest swell with pride. The generous girl from the shelter had become an honorable woman. Helen, What are you trying to say? I'm saying that maybe Mary is exactly the kind of person our family needs, not as a maid, but as family. Edward could hardly believe what he was hearing. Are you saying you accept Mary as part of the family? Helen sighed deeply. I'm saying I'm going to try. It will be difficult for me, Edward. I was raised in a world where appearances matter a lot, but if our son can adapt to this, I can try too. At that moment, Mary entered the room carrying a tray with coffee and carrot cake, which had become Matthew's favourite. "Excuse me," she said. "I brought a snack for you." Helen watched her carefully place the cups on the table, noticing for the first time how Mary knew each family member's tastes, how she anticipated their needs, how she cared for that house with genuine love. "Mary," Helen said, her voice still a bit tense but no longer hostile, "can you sit with us? We need to talk about how we are going to organize our family from now on." Mary looked from Edward to Helen, not fully believing what she was hearing. "Mrs. Helen, are you sure?" "No," Helen replied honestly. "I'm not sure about anything, but I'm sure of one thing. My husband is right. You are family, and families help each other, especially in difficult times." Mary slowly sat down, still not fully believing in Helen's change of attitude. "And now?" Edward asked. "Now," Helen said, taking a deep breath, "we learn to be a real family. A family built on truth, not lies. A family that honors the sacrifices that were made for it to exist." Outside, the Chicago summer was beginning to announce itself, bringing the first rains of December. Inside the Montgomery mansion, a new season was also beginning, the season of truth, forgiveness, and a family finally complete. But the deepest transformations were yet to come. December arrived in Chicago with the suffocating heat characteristic of summer, but inside the Montgomery mansion, a completely new atmosphere had settled in. 3 weeks had passed since Helen decided to accept Mary as part of the family, and the adaptation was proving to be more complex than anyone had imagined. The first major change was practical. Mary was no longer an employee, but she was also not exactly a regular resident of the house. Helen insisted that she continue in the back room until we all get used to the new dynamic, while Edward wanted her to move to the main guest room. "Mrs. Helen," Mary said one morning as they prepared breakfast together, something unthinkable weeks before, "I understand that this is difficult for you. I can look for a small apartment here in the neighborhood, continue visiting the family." "No," Helen interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness of her response. "Edward is right about one thing. You sacrificed your family so that he could have one. This house is yours too." But the phrase came out tense, forced, and both knew that Helen's acceptance was more rational than emotional. The most natural relationship was blossoming between Mary and Matthew. The 16-year-old had embraced the idea of having an aunt with genuine enthusiasm, especially after discovering that Mary knew how to cook the dishes he loved most. "Aunt Mary," he said one Saturday afternoon, "can you teach me to make that chocolate cake you made yesterday? I want to take it to university." "Of course, dear. But why don't you call me Mary instead of Ma'am?" "Because Aunt is family, not an employer," Matthew replied with the characteristic simplicity of youth. The observation struck Helen, who was watching the scene from the kitchen door. Her son had instantly understood something she was still struggling to accept. It was Edward was the one who faced the greatest challenges in adapting. Decades of guilt do not dissolve in weeks, and he felt lost between treating Mary as the sister she had been and dealing with the shame of what he had done. "Jack," Mary called him one night when she found him alone in the office, gazing melancholically out the window. "You need to stop punishing yourself." "What do you mean?" "You haven't looked me in the eye since Helen accepted that I could stay. You don't talk to me properly. You act as if I'm a ghost here to haunt you." Edward sighed deeply. "I just don't know how to act, Mary." For 40 years I learned to live with the guilt of leaving you behind. Now you're here, and I don't know how to be your brother after everything I've done. Want to know how? How? By starting over. The Jack from the home is dead, and the lying Edward is too. Now, we're just two people who love each other as family and are learning to live together. The conversation was interrupted by Helen's arrival, who brought a cup of tea for Edward. "I'm sorry," she said, clearly uncomfortable for interrupting an intimate moment between them. "No, Mrs. Montgomery," Mary said, standing up. "I should go." "Stay," Helen said quickly, surprising herself. "Actually, I want to talk to both of you." Mary sat back down, and Helen pulled up a chair to join them. I've been thinking a lot these past few weeks," Helen began, her words coming out with difficulty. "And I realized I've been doing something very unfair." "What do you mean?" Edward asked. "I've treated this situation as if Mary were an intruder, messing up our perfect life. But the truth is, our life wasn't perfect, it was a lie." Helen looked at Mary, and for the first time, her eyes showed no hostility or distrust. "Mary, do you want to know what my first thought was when Edward told the truth? It wasn't anger at him for lying, it was relief." "Relief?" Mary asked, surprised, "because I finally understood why he always seemed incomplete, why he sometimes became melancholic for no apparent reason, why he never talked about his childhood. He missed you, but he couldn't admit it, even to himself." Edward felt his eyes fill with tears. "Helen, let me finish," she continued. "All these years I thought I was married to a cold man who couldn't open up emotionally. Now I understand that I was married to a man who had lost his family and carried devastating guilt." Mary instinctively reached out to hold Edward's hand, a gesture she hadn't made since childhood. "Mrs. Montgomery," Mary said softly, "you don't have to feel obligated to accept me because of Edward's guilt." "It's not out of obligation," Helen replied, and for the first time her voice sounded genuinely warm. "It's because in these past few weeks, watching you two together, seeing how Matthew has flourished having an aunt, realizing how Edward finally seems complete, I understood something." "What?" "That our family has always been incomplete. You should have always been here." The silence that followed was different from the tense silences of the previous weeks. It was a silence of healing, of acceptance, of a family finally recognizing itself as such. It was broken by Matthew, who appeared at the office door in his pajamas. "Can I come in? I heard you talking and—" "Of course, son," Edward said, gesturing for him to come closer. "I just wanted to say one thing," Matthew said, sitting on the arm of Mary's chair. "These past few weeks have been the best I've ever had in this house." "Why, dear?" Helen asked. "Because it finally feels like we're a real family. Not those magazine families that only come together for pictures. A family where people truly care about each other." The teenager's observation struck all the adults present. "Matthew is right," Edward said. "I spent so much time trying to build a perfect family image that I forgot to build a real family. And I spent so much time worrying about maintaining that image that I forgot to ask if you were happy," Helen added. Mary looked around at the three people who unexpectedly had become her family. "You know what's funniest?" she said. "For 40 years, I dreamed of the day I would find Jack again. But in my dreams, he was always looking for me. I never imagined it would be me who would find him, and that he would be pretending not to know me." Edward laughed, and it was the first genuine laugh he had given in weeks. "And you never imagined that when we finally reunited, you would have to teach me again what family means." "Actually," Mary said, looking at Helen and Matthew, I think we're all learning that together." Helen stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden illuminated by the pool lights. "Mary," she said without turning around, "tomorrow is Sunday. How about we invite Rose for lunch here, and maybe some of your other friends? It's time for this family to stop hiding. The proposal surprised everyone. Helen was suggesting not only accepting Mary, but also her social circle, her friendships, her past life. Mrs. Montgomery, are you sure? Helen turned around and her smile was genuine. I'm sure. In fact, I think I can stop being Mrs. Montgomery to you, don't you think? We are sisters-in-law, after all. It was the first time Helen used the word sisters-in-law to refer to their relationship, and the impact was profound. Helen, Mary said, testing the name without the formal title. Thank you. For what? For giving me a family, for giving a chance to a woman who spent her whole life alone to discover what it's like to have a brother, a sister-in-law, a nephew. No, Helen replied, moving closer and, to everyone's surprise, hugging Mary for the first time. Thank you for not giving up on him 40 years ago, and for not giving up on us. On that night in December, while Chicago slept under the warmth of summer, the Montgomery family was finally complete. Not in the perfect and artificial way that Helen had always imagined, nor in the way that Edward had pretended for decades, but in the real and imperfect way that Mary had dreamed of since childhood. The last piece of the puzzle had finally found its place. March 2025. Autumn had arrived in Chicago, painting the city in golden hues, and in the mansion on the heights that now housed the complete Montgomery family, the changes were visible in every corner. 15 months had passed since Mary first stepped into that house as a maid, and now she walked through the same hallways as a sister, sister-in-law, and aunt. Easter Sunday brought the first big celebration of the new family configuration. The dining room table, which had previously served only for formal dinners with high society guests, was set with a cozy simplicity. A lace tablecloth made by Mary herself, flowers from the garden she lovingly tended, and the unmistakable aroma of bacalao à bras wafting through the house. Aunt Mary, Matthew, shouted from the stairs, "Can I bring David over for lunch? He said he's never had real bacalao." "Of course, dear," Mary replied from the kitchen, "but tell him to hurry, or the fish will get cold." David was the same young construction worker who had found the hidden documents in the office wall months earlier. Recently, he had become a close friend of Matthew, visiting the house with a naturalness that surprised the more snobbish neighbors in the neighborhood. Edward entered the kitchen carrying a bottle of wine, and Mary noticed how different he seemed. The weight of guilt he had carried for decades had given way to a lightness she hadn't seen since their time at St. Vincent's home. At 45, he finally seemed at peace with himself. "How's the bacalao?" he asked, stealing a small piece from the frying pan. "Edward Montgomery!" she scolded, giving him a light slap on the hand as she used to do when they were children. "Get out of my kitchen before I tell Helen that you're snacking on the food." The natural intimacy between them had gradually returned, replacing months of tension and shame. Edward had learned to be the brother he once was, and Mary had discovered that 40 years of separation could not erase true bonds. Helen appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing a simple floral dress, very different from the elaborate outfits she used to wear to entertain guests. In recent months, she had undergone her own transformation, learning to value authenticity over appearances. "Mary, Rose is here, and she brought that passion fruit dessert you taught her." The friendship between Helen and Rose had been one of the most pleasant surprises of recent times. Initially, the socialite and the simple cook seemed to have nothing in common, but they discovered they were both strong women who had spent their lives caring for others. "And what about Mr. Anthony?" Mary asked about the foreman who had become a constant presence at their Sunday lunches. "He's already in the living room, telling Edward about the housing project," Helen replied, smiling. "Those two act like kids when they start talking about architecture." The partnership between Edward and the social housing program had become the most rewarding project of his career, using his technical knowledge to design dignified homes for low-income families gave him a satisfaction that projects for the elite never provided. "Family!" Matthew shouted from the living room. "Let's eat, I'm starving!" Everyone gathered around the table, Edward and Mary side by side, Helen and Matthew in their usual spots, Rose, Mr. Anthony and David completing the circle. The social diversity of that group would have been unthinkable at the time when the family lived for appearances. "Before we start," Edward said, standing up with a glass of wine in hand, "I want to make a toast." "Dad, you always give speeches," Matthew protested, but he was smiling. "This one is special," Edward insisted. 15 months ago, I was a man living a lie. I had professional success, social standing, a family that seemed perfect, but it was all based on denial and shame. Mary held his hand under the table, a gesture of support that had become natural between them. "Today," Edward continued, his voice heavy with emotion, "I'm sitting at the table with people who truly know me, who know my origins, my mistakes, my flaws, and still chose to stay. This is the first time in my adult life that I can say I am completely myself." "Edward," Rose said, her eyes shining with tears, "you know we all here have faced difficulties. No one is going to judge you for where you came from." "Exactly," Mr. Anthony agreed. "In fact, I have more respect for someone who grew up in a shelter and became an architect than for any playboy who inherited everything from their parents." David nodded vigorously. "Dude, my dad always said, what matters is not where you come from, it's what you do with the opportunities life gives you." Helen watched the group around the table and realized something that surprised her. She was happier here, among simple and genuine people, than she had ever been at the formal dinners at the country club. "I also want to make a toast," Helen said, standing up, "to Mary, who taught me that family is not about blood or social standing. It's about choosing to love and care for one another." Mary felt tears streaming down her face. At 53, for the first time in her life, she was surrounded by people who saw her not as a maid or caregiver, but as an essential part of the family. "And I," Matthew said, also standing up, "want to toast to courage, the courage of my father to tell the truth, the courage of my mother to accept change, and the courage of Aunt Mary to never give up on us, even when we deserve it." Everyone raised their glasses, and the toast symbolically sealed the complete transformation of that family. During lunch, conversations flowed naturally among various topics. Matthew shared his plans to study social architecture inspired by his father. Helen talked about the volunteer project she had started at local nursing homes. Edward enthusiastically described new housing projects, and Mary shared her joy of enrolling in an adult literacy course. "Mary," David asked, "are you really going to finish your studies?" "I am," she replied with determination. "I've always wanted to learn to read better, to write properly. Now that I have a family supporting me, I feel like I can achieve all the dreams I put aside." "And what about after the GED?" Mr. Anthony wanted to know. Edward and Mary exchanged smiles. They had talked about this the night before. "After," Mary said, "I will take a technical course in social development. I want to work with children in foster care. I want to use my experience to help others." The revelation moved everyone at the table. Mary, who had given up her own childhood to care for others, would continue doing what she had always done: care. "Aunt," Matthew said, "when you graduate, can I help, like volunteer with you?" "Of course you can, dear. It will be great to have the family working together." The word family was no longer spoken with hesitation or embarrassment. It had become the central concept around which all their lives revolved. After lunch, as everyone helped clear the plates, another significant change in a house where only Mary had done the domestic work. Before, Helen approached her in the kitchen. Mary, can I ask you something? Sure. Have you forgiven me for how I treated you at first? Mary stopped drying the dishes and looked at Helen, her sister-in-law, her friend, her family. Helen, there's nothing to forgive. You were protecting your family in the only way you knew how. I understand that. But I was cruel to you. You were scared, and when people are afraid, they sometimes do things that don't represent who they really are. Helen spontaneously hugged Mary, and this time there was no tension or hesitation in the gesture. Thank you for not giving up on us, Helen murmured. Helen, Mary replied, you are the family I chose 40 years ago. Why would I give up now? As the autumn sun set over Chicago, painting the sky with orange hues that streamed through the mansion's windows, the Montgomery family gathered in the living room to watch the movie Matthew had chosen. Mary sat on the sofa between Edward and Helen, with Matthew lying on the rug, using their legs as a pillow. For the first time in decades, Edward wasn't thinking about work, Helen wasn't worried about social impressions, and Mary didn't feel alone in the world. Aunt Mary, Matthew said sleepily, are you happy? The simple question carried the weight of a lifetime of sacrifices, disappointments, and deferred hopes. Yes, my dear, she replied, stroking her nephew's hair. I am happy. And for the first time in her life, as she spoke those words, Mary Santos Silva, now Mary Santos Silva Montgomery, knew they were completely true. The family she had chosen to protect 40 years earlier at St. Vincent's home was finally reunited, not in the way she had dreamed of as a child, but in an even more beautiful way, as a family that had learned through pain and forgiveness that true love knows no social differences, is not ashamed of its origins, and always finds a way back home. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the Chicago sky, silent witnesses that sometimes, just sometimes, stories have happy endings for those brave enough to fight for them. If you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and if you watched until now, comment, I watched until now, and share your thoughts on this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the final screen. It's very emotional.